Welcome to topic 19. This is the last topic of the term and the last thing that we're going to cover. And the final thing we're looking at today is testing. I'm going to show you how we can test code more thoroughly than just manually entering data into forms and pressing submit. We're going to be looking at automated testing, and that's writing code that tests our code works correctly. And this is a fairly big topic for software engineers. It does require a bit of thinking about to start with, and it does require a slightly different mindset going into writing code. But once you start writing code this way, you will see instantly the benefit of doing so. And you'll find yourself writing much better code as a result because you'll be testing it as you go along and very, very thoroughly. Before I start talking about testing, let's introduce some code that we might want to test. Here's a controller, or part of a controller, that would be for a registration form. So we've got the form and the submit. And what we're really interested in testing is that the submit button works correctly. But a submission would probably have more logic in there than that. And it would probably have some kind of validation. So that's what I've done here. I've just added some validation. I'll quickly run through this code and show you what it's doing. So it starts off by creating a variable called valid and sets it to true. And the way this works is it assumes that the data is valid until it finds out it's not. So it starts off by setting valid to true and then runs a series of checks, and one or more of those checks could then set valid to false. So I've got an if statement for each of the form fields that just checks to see if it's not empty. And if one of the form fields is empty, like for example, if you don't enter an email address, it just sets valid to false. And finally, there's an if statement that says if valid. So that's if valid is still true. And that means it's gone through all of these if statements. None of them have evaluated to true. None of them have set valid to false. And this valid variable is still true. So if any of these if statements evaluates true and any of the form fields are empty, it will set valid to false. So by the time it gets to the final if statement, we know that this valid variable stores whether or not the data is valid. So it will then only save the data into the database if the data has passed all the validity checks. In addition, if it's not valid, we show the form again. So it calls the register form function again, which will then display the form. But most real forms will probably want slightly more detail than that to tell someone what went wrong. Rather than just having a Boolean variable for true or false, we can create an array which contains a list of errors. So if, for example, you leave the first name box blank, it will then add to this errors array, you must enter a first name. If you leave the surname box blank, we can then add to the errors array, you must enter a surname. So it's possible that you could leave all of the fields blank and it would add all of these error messages to the list. So it could add all of these error messages at once to the array. And if you remember, this syntax here is the syntax for adding to the end of an existing array. And then to determine whether the form is valid or not, we can just count the number of error messages. If there were no errors, so if there were 0 errors, then we can save the data into the database. Otherwise, we'll display the registration form again. Only this time, when it displays the registration form, it's actually sending this array of errors as an argument. So we're sending the errors into the registration form so that the registration form can then be shown again and also show any error messages that were occurred. In the registration form function, the one that actually displays the registration form, we can set the author variable to $_post author. So this is the person that's trying to register. So this will be on a joke website if you're registering an author. Or an empty array. So I've used the null coalescing operator again here. So it will either set the author variable to $_post author, if that's set. The first time you go onto the registration page, it would just be a GET request. So if post author's set, it will use that. Otherwise, it will use an empty array. And then we can use this to refill the form fields. So each of the form fields then can check a value in the author array. And we can then pass that into the template. In addition, we can take the argument for the errors, and I showed you this last week, how to create a default value. The errors variable by default is an empty array, but if we're displaying the form again, it will be the list of errors that came from the form submission. And then in the registration form, we can have an if statement that says if there's any errors, display an error message, and then loop through the errors. So it will say something like you must enter a surname, you must enter an email, you must enter a password, and so on. That's a bit of an aside. We don't really need that for today, but I thought I'd include that for completeness. So if you wanted to test it and you wanted to check that this submit function was working correctly, what steps would you have to go through to do that? Keeping in mind you want to check that everything is working as intended. Well, I've got a list of steps that you'd need to go through if you wanted to perform a thorough test. If you wanted to perform a completely thorough test of the code, you would need to open up the web browser, navigate to the right page, and then leave every field blank and press submit, and then check the error messages come up correctly. Leave just the first name blank, but fill in everything else and check the right error is shown. Leave the surname field blank and then check that the right error is shown. Leave the email blank and check that the right error is shown. Leave the password blank and check that the right error is shown. And then do combinations of 2 just to check that combinations of 2 work. And you'll then also fill in every field and check that the record's actually been inserted into the database. But, and although that seems like a very long-winded testing process, if, for example, you did this test, left the password blank, and it didn't show the relevant error message, what you'd really need to do after you'd fixed it and then this test passed is you'd actually need to go back to the start and check you hadn't broken anything else and run this test again, and this test again, and this test again, and this test again, just to make sure that you hadn't broken something when you fixed the original bug. So you fixed the bug at this stage, but doing so, you might have introduced a bug in this test. There's no way you to know that without going through and testing it again. And similarly, if you then get onto this test here and find a bug and fix it, you'd once again have to go back to the start and check that when you made your change, it didn't break one of the other tests. So that's a thorough testing strategy, but it would require a significant amount of time. You would have to go through and repeat all the tests over and over and over again. And this is a long-winded process because every test would require you going into the browser, finding the correct page, filling in the relevant form fields, pressing submit, and then checking that the result looks like it is what it should be. And you'd need to do that for each of those tests that I showed you. And for each of those tests that you had to repeat, you'd have to go through and repeat the process again. Testing is boring. It's not a fun thing to go through and write out form fields and press submit over and over and over again. It's a very boring, repetitive process. And people don't tend to like boring, repetitive processes. They're not very interesting. So what you would probably end up doing is getting to the state, say test 3, fixing a bug in that, and then just moving directly on to test 4 and ignore the fact that you might have broken something somewhere else in the code. But that assumption is wrong. And although that's what most people would do, they wouldn't want to go back and retest something they've already tested because it's boring and repetitive. Luckily for us, one thing that likes a boring and repetitive task is a computer. Computers are very good at boring, repetitive tasks. They're good at just doing the same thing over and over again. So we can actually get the computer to do some of this test for us. So rather than manually going into the web browser and pressing submit on submit buttons all the time, we can just have the computer run that test for us. And the computer can effectively mimic pressing the submit button with some relevant data and then checking that the right result is shown. One of the issues that you'll come across if you want to start doing automated tests is that you need to write the code in such a way that it's easily testable. And one of the things that makes this somewhat difficult is if your code's linked to the post array, then obviously it requires a real form submission to work because that variable is created by PHP. You can kind of override it and you can somewhat work around that, but it's better to avoid using $_post or $_get inside your code and just pass them in as arguments. The second thing you need to be able to do is isolate the code that you want to test. You want to be able to just run the block of code that you wish to test. So, for example, if the only way you can get to a form submission is by logging in as a certain user, adding things to the basket, going to the checkout page, having to have a page that loads the entire website layout, has the header, the footer, navigation bar, and then has the form in the middle, and you press submit and you go to the next page. If the only way of doing it is going through that entire process, and that page also then prints out a load of other stuff as well, then it's very difficult to test just the block of code that you want to test. And writing any kind of automated test on some large generated HTML is not going to be very successful. So we can't have testing that involves also generating HTML. We just want to know whether the code that we're testing is working as intended or not, rather than checking the entire website layout every single time. So we can fix both of these issues fairly easily by moving code into a function. We can then just run that function in isolation. So as long as we've got a function that contains the code that we're wanting to test at this moment, we've then isolated the code that we want to test. And regardless of how you'd normally access that through the website, even if you had to normally be logged in and you'd normally have to have gone through a checkout process and added things to your basket and so on, we can ignore that and go straight to running the function that is doing the task that we want to test. We also then need to remove the reliance on a form submission. So the post variable, and we can easily avoid using $_post by just making that an argument or a class variable rather than directly relying on $_post or $_get. So let's imagine we wanted to test the validation logic was correct. I've moved the code into a function in the same class. So it would actually be in the same class as the register submit function. So we've just moved this into its own function. I've called it validate registration. It takes an argument, in this case, author. So we can pass that in as an argument. So we're taking $_post author, passing that into the function as an argument, and then we can do all of the validation checks and finally return the list of errors. And then we can have the same if statement we had here. But importantly, now that that's in its own function, we can easily test this code because we can just run this function with any given data we like and check to see if it returns the right set of error messages. And we can now write code to mimic different form submissions to run this function. And we can just pass in any old data we like at this point as test data and check to see if this code is working as intended. And the way automated tests work is they describe what is expected to happen when certain inputs are provided. So they'll say that when the username is left blank, it should return this particular error message. If the username and the password are left blank, there should be 2 error messages, and so on. So we can express what should happen if the function is working correctly. And if any of the tests fail and the tests say the function is not doing what we expect it to do, then we know that there's an issue in the function that needs to be fixed. Here's a very crude test. So I've got my instance of the author controller. In reality, you might need to pass an argument here if you wanted to run this code, but for simplicity, I haven't done that here. And the test describes what should happen in different circumstances. So with this test data, this is the data I'm testing, I would expect, if the function is working as it should be, that with this test data, where the first name has been left blank, I should get 1 error message. So that's what the test is doing here. The test, this code being the test, is describing what should happen when this data is sent as the form submission. So if someone were to submit the form with this test data, we would expect them to get 1 error. And in this case, I've just got an if else after running the function. So I've got errors equals author controller validate registration. So we're calling the function that we want to test, passing it the test data that I'd set up here. And now we're able to test that this function works correctly without having to go into the browser and manually submit the form with this data. We can just run the function And what's important is that once we've written this test, anytime we make a change to this function, we can just run this test again, run the page that contains this code, and check that we haven't broken that process. And I've just got an if statement that says if the number of errors is equal to 1, then the test passed. And in this case, test passed means this function, validate registration, is working as intended. It's working as we're expecting it to. If for some reason it doesn't give us one error, so if with this test data we get 2 errors or no errors or any other number of errors, then it will say test failed. And I can know just by looking at the output of this code, test passed or test failed, whether or not the function is working correctly. And on the same page, I could then add different tests for different outcomes. I've got one array here, which would mimic a blank form submission. So just going on, leaving all forms blank and pressing submit. And I'm saying that in this case, I would expect there to be 4 error messages. If I had valid data, so I had data that looked like this, I would expect there to be no errors. And I know if I run this page that contains all 3 of these tests, I know if any of the tests come back as failed, then I need to go back and edit the function, fix the code inside the function, and then rerun the tests again. And what I would do is I'd have a test for every possible permutation, and then anytime I make any slight change to this function, I'll just rerun all the tests. And if I don't see on my page test passed, test passed, test passed, test passed, I know that something I've done has broken one of the tests. And it means that I can just go onto the page and it will run all of the tests almost instantaneously and tell me whether the function is working correctly. And anytime I change it, I then know if I've broken something without having to go back and test anything again. Now, this obviously does mean you need to spend some time writing code for the tests. But once you've got that code written, you can just then rerun that code every single time you make a change to the function and check that you haven't broken any of the functionality in the function.